Hi everybody, this is a video that I wanted to film for quite a long time now. It's something that's proved quite useful when I've done workshops, which is showing people how to come off auto on the camera and to use the camera on the aperture priority setting. And then towards the end I'm going to show you how to make the quite easy step onto shooting on full manual, if that's what you're interested in as well, which of course is good. If you want to get to the how-to bit, just fast forward to the pink background bit and you'll get straight in there. But yeah, so what I'm going to tell you how to do basically is to shoot on aperture priority, which is sort of a halfway house between auto, a bit more than a halfway house between auto and manual. You're deciding everything except the shutter speed on the camera. So you've got quite a lot of control over the various settings. I really love this mode. It's something that works really well for me because I'm very kind of into controlling my depth of field and working out when I'm getting a nice blur or not. And that's exactly what aperture priority mode is set up for. Obviously you can shoot on S, which is when you're deciding the shutter speed, and then P is when you're just deciding the overall exposure, I think. So that's sort of one less, that's one step closer to auto than aperture and shutter modes. Making the step to full manual is actually quite easy in the way that it's set up on the Olympus cameras, because you're using the overall exposure compensation value as your guide, and you will move your shutter speed up and down and trying to get a certain setting, i.e. 0 on your exposure, to ensure that you've got a correctly exposed photograph. The other things I'm going to talk you through on the camera are how to select your focal point, which I think is a really important thing to be able to do on your camera. It sort of allows you to take full control of your photography basically, which is telling the camera exactly where you want to focus your focal point. So you're telling the viewer of your photograph where it is you want them to look. We're going to look at the super control panel, which I'm always banging on about, but this gives you the sort of easiest access to all the settings on the Olympus cameras. This includes the OMD because it's got the same menu set up. This comes set up on the EPR 9, on the EPL 8 and 7, unfortunately you've got to set up yourself. So on my blog post, 15 tips and tricks on my blog for the Olympus Pen, it will show you how to set up the super control panel, and this is something I highly recommend. It's absolutely the very first thing I will do with any Olympus Pen camera that I get my hands on. And then I look at a couple of the new AP mode on the EPR 9, which gives you direct access to things like double exposure and HDR settings, which are in the cameras anyway, but it just kind of gives you a more direct route to getting to them. And what else? Just basically how you're controlling your aperture with the dial and the buttons and the overall exposure value. So I hope it's useful. Please ask me any questions. This is how I shoot on the Olympus Pen. Other people will shoot differently. They have different objectives. They enjoy the camera, using the camera a different way. This is just what works for me. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Bye. Okay, so this is a video I've been meaning to do for a while, as I said in my intro. I'm going to teach you how to come off auto, initially onto aperture priority, and then at the end just switching over to full manual if that's what you're interested in doing. So I'm going to tell you how I use this camera, and this is how I shoot every day in the most sort of efficient and easy way for me. So first of all, you need to set your mode dial. So this is currently on iAuto. You want to set your mode dial to A, which is aperture priority. Okay, so aperture priority is not fully manual. Aperture priority allows you to set the the aperture, which is your f-stop, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, but the camera decides the shutter speed for you. Just so you know, S is when you decide the shutter speed and the camera decides aperture priority, and P is when you can set the overall exposure and the camera will decide the other things for you. I like A because I am interested in prime lenses and creating depth of field. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk you through, well, let's just have a quick look at controlling your aperture through with the camera. So this is quite easy. So as you can see, what's highlighted in green here is your f-stop. F-stop is your aperture. Aperture is the hole which lets the light into the camera. It's a bit confusing, but anyway, the easiest way for me to understand it is the lower the number, the bigger the hole, so you've got more light coming in. The higher the number, you're making the hole smaller and there's less light coming in. How this affects your camera is when you've got your f-stop completely wide open at the lowest number, then you're going to get a blurry background. As you go higher, the blurry background disappears and more of the image comes into focus. So anything f8 and above will be good for landscapes. f11 is a pretty good one for landscapes, so keeping everything in focus. And if you want to go all the way up something crazy like f22, go crazy, that's when you can get really nice sun star flares on your picture. I spend a lot of my time with my aperture wide open because I like a lot of light to come in, and also that allows the lens to function in a sort of a very fast way as well. The more light, the more quick the camera will respond to when you take pictures. Anyway, so the ways to do that on your Olympus Pen, as you can see, the green highlighted f-stop at the moment is set to be controlled by the dial. You can also tap this plus minus here to highlight your overall exposure compensation. So perfect exposure, and this is the sort of value of all the other settings equate to make this number. Perfect exposure is at 0, and if you want to lighten things up in a kind of override kind of way, you can use the this sort of menu button here, and you can definitely do this. I mean, I know a lot of bloggers who will have their exposure maybe at 0.7, sometimes 1, not really. I usually have it at 0.3 or 0, and if you want to go darker, it's not really showing up on the screen at the moment. That's because I've got quite a lot of light here, I guess. But anyway, that's just a way to kind of override everything with your exposure value. And then as you can see here, this number here is your shutter speed, and that's what the camera is deciding for you. But there are other things that you can make decisions on in the camera. And this is the super control panel, which is something I always bang on about and so important to set up. I'll link you to a post which shows how to set this up. I think on the EPR9 it's already set up. I know on the OMD models it's already set up. On the EPR7 and EPR8 you've got to kind of bring it up. So you know that it's set up if you press OK, there you go, and you get this huge menu here. So I find it quite easy. If I want to shoot fast and easy, oops, I will go through my super control panel, sorry, it's focusing, and look at all the different functions. So here's your ISO. ISO is another aspect of what lets light into your camera. So if it's a very kind of sunny day, we've got lots of light, you might have your ISO at 200, 250, maybe 200 to 400. If you're indoors, you might want to be shooting at about 400. And then if you're sort of in low light, you can pump it all the way up. Bear in mind that the higher you go, the more grain you will introduce. So for grain-free photographs, you want to keep it as low as possible. In all honesty, I often keep this on auto just because light conditions are very variable and very changing, and it's quick to have the camera decide the auto for you. White balance is this WB here. Again, it's something you can keep on auto, but it's quite nice to sort of play around with the white balance. You can even just flick through. I mean, look at the difference here between sunny and shade. If you want something much warmer, if you've got a cloudy day. Also, what's really useful for white balance is being able to capture your own custom white balance setting. So this is really easily done. Hang on, if I just get a piece of white paper, I can do this for you. Bear with me. Okay, so if you want to set, hang on. If you want to set your custom white balance, you would go into white balance there. So you've got the little flower which signifies. Click on the flower, and then you want to click info, and as you can see it says point the camera at a sheet of white paper. I'm going to do that. Take the photograph. Okay, so if you want to set, hang on. If you want to set your custom white balance, you would go into white balance there. So you've got the little flower which signifies. Click on the flower, go into there, capture white balance. So press info, point the camera at a sheet of white paper. Okay, now you want to save the information you've just got, and now you've got a custom white balance for what your sorry, everything's flicking off. So what you have just chosen, and then you can shoot in these conditions. Just don't leave it on there, because then when you shoot in different conditions, you will find it will look kind of weird. So for safety, you can just go back to auto, or another thing worth noting is that incandescent was really useful if you are shooting in yellow artificial light, and this will throw a blue light over everything and then sort of neutralize that. Anyway, let's leave that on auto for the moment. Oops, there we go. So other things to be aware of in here, Olympus does have kind of these ranges of filters. I quite like natural, muted sometimes. A lot of people use eye enhance, and it does kind of really work for them because it does sort of brighten everything up. Again, that's something for you to decide and have a look through. So spot focus is a good place to be. That's what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you how to select your focus point, which I'll show you in a minute, but let's just go through everything else quite quickly. I tend to have my face priority off because I find that when it's on, it often conflicts with what I'm trying to focus on, and that will come up when I tell you about selecting a focal point. But obviously if you're shooting people, it's quite good to have that on. What else have we got here? If you want to shoot in RAW, there you go. You can shoot in a RAW file. You can shoot in large, fine and RAW. At the moment I don't really shoot in RAW. I find the files a bit unwieldy, and I find that my images, I'm not looking for that extra information, to be honest. I'm kind of okay with the images I'm taking. Shooting RAW is a really kind of exciting, fun thing to do, because you can rescue photographs and get a lot more out of them, should you so wish. What else have we got going? That's to do with filming. We can look at that later. This is the ratio of photographs that we're taking. So if you want to shoot square, you can flick through. There's 1:1 for square. I tend to shoot on 4:3. What else have we got here? Anti-shock, which is great, or you can just have it on normal. This is something that I will talk about another time. Okay, so that's kind of super control panel. Now I want to talk about selecting a focal point, because this is the single most important thing I find for taking photographs. So you can do touch screen if you want, touch screen to take a photograph, touch screen to focus where you want it to take, and then you can snap it. I don't really like that. I turn it off, but that's just me. I think it's really important to be able to sort of tell the camera where you want it to look. This is where you want to be. You want to be moving your green autofocus box around the screen. So that is going to give you the most control, and that's when you can get a bit creative about where you want to put things. Oops, don't do that. There we go. And as you can see, that's moving around. So half press to focus. Use this brackets with the buttons here to move it around, half press to refocus, take your picture. Okay, so it's worth bearing in mind that when you're sort of playing with depth of field, what you really want to do is get really close up to your subject. This is not a good example, but you want to get close up to your subject and have lots of distance behind to get really good depth of field. Okay, so the next thing is looking at going fully manual. So we've been shooting on A. Let's take you on to fully manual here. It's really not that scary because the way this camera is set up is that it kind of makes it easy for you in the sense that it's getting you to focus on the shutter speed, which is here, and here you've got your exposure. So really that's the guide that you want to use, okay? As you can see at the moment, the exposure is up +2, which is really quite bright. So by using the dial, which is what will control what's highlighted in green, if you roll it one way, it's going to affect the exposure. If you roll it the other way, it's going to help you bring the exposure back to something a bit more correct and a bit more manageable. So here, I've got the exposure back to perfect exposure, 0, 0. With your aperture, so what I did there was that I just pressed ± to highlight that, and it will tell you that, oops, sorry, come on, it's giving you sort of the arrows to tell you if you go left and right, there's your aperture, so you can play there, you can keep playing around with your exposure. So it's just really a bit of a game to kind of keep your exposures, to keep the exposure at a level that your picture is going to be correctly exposed, and you're sort of using the other settings, which is your shutter speed and your aperture, to take a picture. So let's see what happens. Okay. And then you just need to look at your result and sort of decide, was that the effect that you wanted? Is that how you wanted it to look? So depending on what type of effects you're seeking, that's when you'll start making sort of aesthetic decisions on how low, how big a number your aperture could be, or how little a number it should be, and with your shutter speed. And that's obviously kind of moves into things like long exposure, night photography, and you have to compensate in other ways to make sure that your exposures, you're going to have correct exposure. But if you're trying to get certain effects, you've got to kind of build everything in the right way. More than anything, it's just practice and taking loads and loads of photographs. Yes, there are more things that this camera does. We could have a quick look at AP, which is new on the EPR9. And this is something that gives you direct access to different sort of things you can do. Multiple exposure, HDR is quite fun. So if I do an HDR just now, as you can see, it shoots loads. What's going to happen? You get quite nice looking pictures actually. Okay, let's have a look. If you're, let me go back, tap back into there. Double exposure is quite fun. I've got nothing, hang on, let's do that. And then as you can see, is that going to work? This is something I'm not very good at. It takes a lot of sort of creative thought to get a really good double exposure, in my opinion. What else have we got here? Oh, and obviously Olympus has the art filters. There's a new one which is quite nice. This is the one I quite like at the moment, the bleach bypass, which you can play around with as well. Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm telling you about today. I hope it was kind of use. Please let me know any questions, and I can do more videos looking at certain aspects if that is what you're after.